I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, and welcome to Arcane Mark. Design, diary, blending, mechanics, and narrative. Or is it narrative and mechanics? Who knows
Either
what
way,
order we're going to do
it's blending both of them.
Getting your peanut butter and your chocolate.
One thing to talk about up front with this sort of blend is considering the amount of weight and emphasis that you give to a certain part. That's one of the first things I think about. In the same way that, you wouldn't have a final boss battle that you resolve with just a couple of rolls, and you wouldn't make like an entire subsystem out of like, oh yeah, this is what happens when your PC is getting ready in the morning. Yes, thank you for handing me off a cute little scheming dolphin-y Almadamon. You thinking about when you're putting something together, how much weight you want it to give it how much weight you give something in the mechanics really shapes how important it feels to the players. And if you have a mismatch between how much weight it has in the mechanics and the narrative, then it can kind of feel like something either breezed by too fast that was supposed to be important, or that you're wasting time focusing on something that's not so significant.
That's right. But before we get into some of those specifics, let's talk a little bit about what it means to blend mechanics and narrative, and like this sort of the idea of like ludonarrative consonance and dissonance, why you would want to do so, and what sort of the pitfalls are of not blending mechanics and narrative. So sometimes if you're a designer, and you know what, I've designed a lot of things, I've been guilty of this sometimes too, you have like this beautiful mechanic and you're just like, this is the best mechanic possible to represent what I wanted to do. But sometimes it just doesn't fit the narrative of what's going on at all. Then that can be a problem. And similarly, if you just want to tell a story and it doesn't even remotely make any sense with the way that any of the mechanics work, and it's just sort of bulldozing through, that as the GM or a designer are the best way to get players extremely frustrated that just it was like, well, you know what? Whoever wrote this adventure just kind of wanted these things to happen, and there's no way they would have. Just like they write these cutscenes that don't make any sense, and it makes you feel like you've lost your agency. Yeah. So it's very, very important that you blend mechanics and narrative. It's a further step of the idea, the Stormwind fallacy that's like, some people are like, well, you can only either be an optimizer or someone who cares about role play for your character.
But not both.
Not both. That's the fallacy. But in truth, actually, it's really important to, as a game designer, to combine both of them and make them work together in a way that really sort of sings and feels like, yes, I feel like I'm doing the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. Because even if you make it hard, even if you make it challenging, even if you make something that's like, ooh, that was nasty, it still feels right if it blends the mechanics and the narrative together. Whereas if you just kind of narratively throw a fiat, then people are just going to get pretty upset, pretty disempowered. And if you just put in mechanics that don't make any sense in the narrative, where you're just like, well, you know what, these powers don't work on Tuesdays. Yeah. Why? I figured out mechanically they couldn't. Is there an explanation in the game? No. They just don't work on Tuesdays, like in real life. Because Pathfinder Society each week does a thing on Tuesdays where they give double hero points, and we don't want to combine it with that.
Yeah, or something like that. Yeah.
Like, there's certain mechanics. Okay, that's not even a good mechanic. Sometimes you'll have a good mechanic that actually has an issue where it just doesn't fit into the narrative at all.
Like if there's a story about, a certain, like, people having an infinite wellspring of magic, and then you're doing it with the system where it's like, well, it's not balanced if people have an infinite wellspring of magic, so then they're gonna have a once per day magic power, then that doesn't jive with the system.
And then the story is just like, is there once per day? No. None of the NPCs do it once per day. There's fiction written about it where they don't do it once per day, but in the game mechanics, you do, because it would be busted if you could do it that many times.
Like, I want to talk about some more of these sort of like top level things in terms of like mapping the complexity. Another top level mapping that's important to have is mapping sort of the threat or danger or difficulty. If there's something that in the narrative is supposed to be easy for characters to achieve, it shouldn't be onerous for them to achieve in the mechanics. And if there's something that's supposed to be something that you really need to work for, then it shouldn't be, easy to achieve in the mechanics. You wouldn't want to be like, oh yeah, this is supposed to be something everyone does, and it's a DC 50 skill check or whatever.
Right. I'll try to give some examples of all of these as we go along. So to give an example of something that has an issue in terms of exactly that high level principle that Linda is talking about. Linda and I, we play Changeling the Dreaming 50th
or 20th anniversary, yeah.
Not 50th, gosh, it's not 50th.
It hasn't been around that long, yeah.
C20, 20th anniversary edition. In that edition, the narrative is like, oh my gosh, you know what? Everybody doesn't get enough glamour and there's problems, but it's actually glamour being like the power source that your characters have. But in the mechanics, it's just ridiculously easy to get enough. You have more than enough, and it would be very difficult to actually be running out in the way that the setting has claimed that you are, based on the mechanics of how they are given back, not just to your players, but also even to sort of the non-player characters that are around in the world. There's like a variety of mechanical ways that you could change it from that would probably make the gameplay not work very well. But as a result, it just is sort of like there's this underlying undercurrent of like it's rare and people are going to be stingy with it, while actually like no, you have plenty.
Yes.
You have plenty. And so like the way that I tried to square the circle is just by having people be sort of traditional and just like be saving up even though they didn't have to, and worried about it more than they really should be. And then a few sort of more radical NPCs and PCs who just spend it like it really actually is being earned, and other people look down on them for sort of wastefully.
Yeah, because there's also in that setting that idea that, that resource is diminishing over time in the amount that it exists. So you can kind of try to play around with that, but it does create some challenges in that way.
It like sort of, but in other
ways,
but
it's more like diminishing over the long term.
If you don't use the way that like causes it to go down, then you're actually supposedly increasing it.
It's weird.
So,
it's weird.
That's just one example of that. To give other examples of why it's really, really important to start off by looking into sort of what is the narrative. A great example is playable dragons. I've done playable dragons. Multiple people have. And the playable dragons I have heard about before this, which were not really in PF2, but they were in some other systems, either were just like, look, it's playable dragons, it's overpowered, they're worth more than a full PC, they're just better, that's what it is, it's a dragon. Which, they know what the narrative they want is. And they've sacrificed the mechanics of being able to use any of the rest of the game system or balance for it, unless everyone plays a dragon, or they're like, well, other people can just be your kind of followers, and the dragon is just better, and you count them as multiple people. Then there's the other side of playable dragons that you sometimes see, where it just is like, hey, we're going to do playable dragons, and with no explanation, they are balanced, and it's just like, okay, yeah, they can't fly. Why? Well, they're playable dragons, and they don't really have breath weapons anymore. Why? They're playable dragons, and they're just kind of balanced, and they go up as like a dragon class, and you eventually get the stuff back at the appropriate levels, roughly, for a character, and then that works. But the problem with that one is that people are just like, why can't I do it? I'm a dragon.
So you need a narrative to explain
exactly
why those mechanics are in place where they are.
When I wrote my take on it, I made sure the first thing I started with was we have a solid explanation. What's going on? What does it mean? And then that allowed me to use it as a springboard for thought experiments, because what I did is I created a ritual called the Lux Aeterna ritual. Dragons perform when they don't want to wait 2,000 years to get all their power, but want to be able to get it really fast. They short-circuit their magic, which is used for everything, since something of a weight of a dragon wouldn't fly without some magic, and their breath needs some magic. Short-circuit it, which temporarily weakens it, but causes it to grow extremely quickly in stressful situations and when sort of exercised. And that way, when they level up, they suddenly become Great Worm level of power very, very quickly. the existence of this in the world is huge, and it has lots of societal implications. I wrote dozens of pages about how every type of dragon has like generational gaps and sort of societal differences that are based on dragons who perform the ritual versus what the dragons who didn't perform the ritual think about that, and what it means to them, how they work together or apart, or even try to kill each other in some cases for some of the evil dragons. And so it not only justified the mechanics in a way that feels right, it doesn't feel like, oh, it's just because it's for balance reasons, but there's no real actual reason, but it also is a springboard that created tons of interesting lore and conflicts that you can play out that can just give you ideas for more characters. That's at its best what the benefit is of making sure that your mechanics are blended in with narrative.
Yeah, and you make a really good point there about the larger scale too. If you look at like, a setting where it is supposed to be a high magic setting, for example, you're going to have a lot of those magical effects that are around that you want to have available, or a setting where it makes a big difference, and we've seen this in some of our games too. What level of NPCs are generally around and how powerful they are versus what the role the PCs are supposed to play in the story. If you have a story where the PCs are, much more powerful than everyone else around them, but then the story tries to cast them as like weak new kids on the block, then it doesn't really necessarily work. Versus if you have a story where it's like where everyone around is super high level and then they're going to the first level PCs being like, oh, help us, then it doesn't really make sense too. This is something we've definitely had to deal with a lot in society scenarios, because those weight a lot toward those lower levels. So there are certain stories that don't work so well at lower levels because it's like, well, why would they be asking you low-level characters to handle
The Whispering Tyrant has returned. First level PCs, it's up to you.
Yes, it's up to you to save the day.
Why us? He has a registrar of all the Pathfinders that were given by a trader, except for whoever signed up in the last month, which is you. And he's put up a ward that blocks all of them, except for the people who aren't in the register. We have our
classic example.
And we brought you this artisan shield, so even at first level, it kind of buffs you up so that the Whispering Tyrant has stats that are level appropriate.
I mean, how many times have scenarios said something along the lines of, yeah, well, they know our experienced agents around here. We just need someone to kind of poke around and figure out what's going on.
Yes, I know. That's why I kind of use that as
That's the one we always do. Yeah.
Is that exactly?
Ash eventually says, rulers are back. Good luck, level 1 fighters. Yeah.
That's right. So, no, absolutely though. If you have certain mechanical constructs or constructs and constrictions in restrictions rather in your adventures that you work on as well, and you want to make them be narratively justified, or people are just going to feel like they're just so meta.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah, and another thing to look at too is, for example, when you're looking at how do NPCs accomplish certain things, you want to make sure that they are doable with tools that the PCs can understand and that work within the system. You don't want to just be like, oh yeah, this NPC has arbitrary powers to do whatever. You would want to say, maybe they have a ritual, but then the PCs can learn how the ritual works, and the ritual is balanced at a power level that's appropriate for the kind of level of stuff that NPC should have access to. So it doesn't feel arbitrary, but there is, even if the players may not see everything on screen, behind the scenes with the GM and with the writing the published adventure, you want to make sure that there's a mechanical explanation for everything that happens and that that's consistent. That you have people, growing in power over time, and that they're using they don't like use a tool once and then forget that they have it. You definitely see that problem a lot in fiction, where like an author just comes up with something to get out of one problem, and then later on they don't use it again.
Time turners! Oh, never again.
Yeah, that was an example. That's definitely an example of that. So I know that it's kind of, well, it is a blend, right? When you do have these kinds of mechanical effects and these powers that they're used consistently.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And that you have a structure of knowing what certain folks are capable of, so it's not just suddenly like, oh, I just pulled this out of nowhere, or you don't risk contradicting yourself by making something that isn't consistent and then later having to go in and fix it.
Right. And if you use something that makes sense in the narrative for your mechanics, it makes your mechanics easier to learn for players. not only is it easier to justify that they do the thing that you wanted them to do, but it's easier to learn, easier to remember, and easier to apply again later. Like, for example, I'll use the influence system that is in PF2, but it's based off of the PF1 influence that was like written by Linda, based off of an adventure by Thurston Hillman, and it's a good example of blending mechanics and narrative, specifically the restrictions on how and why certain characters could go around influencing other people. And I will compare it to other things that had been printed before them that are worse to show you why it's better. So up until the point where that sort of became the standard for influence encounters, the one that you see in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, what you would often see is just like, oh, there's 5 NPCs. So you go up to each one at a time, and you're between your team, you can make 3 checks. Now, this would then sometimes vary between just like, 3 checks. It could be anyone. It could be the same person 3 times. Or sometimes they would just be like, what they do is that one person talks, and then they roll a check, and then after that, the NPC just yells, "Shut up!" Anytime that person tries to talk, no, never again, no, gone. I'm listening to Bergdar the Barbarian with 5 charisma who's belching over there because that is who I will talk to.
The adventure says that I will only speak to each person once.
No, there's like 12 adventures at least that I've played that actually literally had that, where it just refused to listen to anybody else and then just would call on the worst possible person because they hadn't rolled a check yet. So the problem with that is just everyone gets frustrated. Like, why do you need to hear from Bergdar the Barbarian this time? Like, but Bergdar's like, I don't want to do it. I might fail by 5 or more, or do something that causes a problem.
Another thing that the influence system looks to rectify is the idea that a social encounter would only be for people who have high charisma skills. It looks to make sure that there is a sensible way for people to participate. Regardless of their skills, as long as you say like, oh, this NPC cares about crafting, and so you can try to use crafting to influence them, or that sort of thing. And in the influence system, then you have the sort of narrative limiter that comes in there is time.
Yes,
you can only be in one place at once, because the influence system is designed so that there are more people to talk to and not enough time for one person to go get all of the influence with everyone. So you have to split
passes, there's an event. Yeah. Things might happen after in between each check. It's such a natural way to have a person feel like, oh yeah, that's why I can't do that. Of course I can't. Whereas like having them be like, shut up. It's like, no, but listen, please don't make me shut up, because I know I made the first diplomacy check, but I'm literally a professional lawyer, and the next thing you want is a law check.
Oh, too bad.
And nope, we're asking Bergdar the Barbarian. He doesn't know anything about law. No, it just says we are. Well, could you have told me that before this? No, as soon as you rolled, you're locked out. Why? Because I won't listen to you. Like, it just makes... It is a recipe for frustration for the players, for players to possibly argue to try to go against it. The GM just be like, look, the adventure makes me do this. It makes no sense. Please roll with it. And most players will at that point, but they're not going to be happy about it. Whereas with time, you don't even need to get into that, because it's like, oh yeah, of course I can't be in 2 places at once.
Yeah, it's like, all right, who do you want to influence and how do you want to influence them? And then the discovery, which exists for like more of those sense motive-y, well, or now perception sense motive-y folks to who, because some people would say in a social scene like, well, my character doesn't want to talk to anyone. And so that gives them a chance to participate and also explain to explain how the PCs might know what the most effective ways to influence someone is, because some tables might like, oh, here's the list of all the skills that you can use to influence them, but that's also kind of like a weird meta thing. If you haven't met this person before, how do you know what's going to be most effective? So that gives some levers for an in-game explanation for why you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a perfect example of blending the mechanics with the narrative in such a way that it's easy to learn. You won't have any arguments about that, and it does what it's intended to do, which is give spotlight to everybody and allow everybody to participate in their own way.
Another thing in the system too is strengths and weaknesses, which is it's kind of a list of things that for strategies or mentions for which the PCs will get a bonus or penalty on their check. So if you have an NPC who who's really proud of their bonsai tree collection, and you start talking to them about bonsai trees, then maybe they would like you more. If you have an NPC who is tired of being underestimated because she's short and you like make short jokes, then you're gonna take some penalties.
That makes sense. A little penalty.
Boop.
So basically, this is a good example of a subsystem that does it right versus a lot of adventures that did not do it well, and that I've literally seen lead to arguments when I tried to run them in organized play, where you can't really change to be like, no, sorry, we will let you do all of those checks. You have to be like, well, no, it says that you can't, so I can't change that because that's organized play. There's numerous ways that this comes into play. It's not just for subsystems, it's for how like a class works. They really need to blend mechanics and narrative to make it feel like you're playing the class fantasy of being that class. That's one where if you get it wrong, you can have some serious problems.
Yeah, like even if it's as simple as like, oh, the fighter, someone who's playing a fighter wants to be able to hit things, so they have a high bonus or something, or like with other classes like the monk's flurry, someone who's playing a monk wants to be able that fantasy has to do with like, you know, your rapid fire punching or kicking something.
Yeah, absolutely. Plus also if the story of a class is like, I'm the one who's the most like the class is like that they're more trained in weapons, whereas other people may have like inherent protections, then the mechanics should back that up by giving them more training in weapons, for example, for a fighter. Whereas in previous editions, they had that, and they just weren't. In some cases, other people were equally trained and had a bunch of other stuff too. Let's see. There was people in chat talking about GMs who did not do things that way, and that led to some problems. So, like, you know, there's nothing wrong with telling a story that doesn't have a game in it, but if you're playing a tabletop RPG or a lot of other games, you want to blend mechanics and narrative because that's why you came here. That's what you love doing. You want to tell a story, but you want the mechanics to be in it. You don't want to be fighting with the mechanics. You want to be blending them in. And this isn't just for tabletop RPGs. I've said before that, like, in board games, it's nice if you have mechanics and narrative blend too. I've said that Spirit Island is one that does that for me. I always feel like the spirits have a good feeling that I'm playing the type of thing that I'm supposed to embody.
Yeah, like for example, when you often play the Ocean's Hungry Grass, the Ocean Spirit, and the Ocean Spirit has mechanics that will cause you to, you know, on some turns you surge in and expand toward the board and increase your influence, and
onto
then onto the beach, and then other turns you need to pull back toward the ocean and reclaim your resources.
It's very, very powerful since you're on an island. The ocean is obviously a pretty important part of the island, but the inland spaces I completely cannot reach. There's like one card out of a giant deck that if I randomly draw it as one of my power-ups, then I can reach like once into the middle of the island. If I do not get that card, which I usually won't, I never will be able to. I'll have to rely on my allies as the ocean. And it really feels like it really has personality. It feels like isolating in some ways, that like I'm completely isolated from that center area. I'm powerless there, but you feel incredibly powerful in the actual oceany areas, and I feel like I'm playing an angry ocean that wants to destroy everything.
And then conversely, with the character that's probably my favorite, Spread of Rampant Green, you can very quickly spread all around the map. But you also might get some of your branches snipped off. But if they get snipped off, then you could, you know, so to speak, because you can lose some of your tokens from the board. But unlike a lot of other characters, if you run out of tokens, you can draw them back out and place them on the map again. So it creates that feeling of growing quickly, and you might get pruned back and need to deal with that, but then you can just sprout again and grow.
Plus, you can grow over cities and stuff like Midgar in Final Fantasy, where it's just all grown with plants, but ultimately, like, explorers who are just going off into the woods just don't care about what you're doing. You, as that character, you almost can't stop them from exploring out, but you are easily able to stop their settlements from doing too much at the cost of your plants.
Yeah. Or then you've got, like, the mountain character who is slow but has big, powerful powers and great defenses.
The mountain character may be one of the best examples of that because it doesn't force you to do anything, but mountain character's deal, it's one of the basic starter characters for Spirit Island, is that it's, like, it's strong. but it's stubborn and quick. It's slow to change. It rarely is able to learn new things. And the way they did that, which I think is kind of brilliant for that starter mountain character, is that it normally you could choose at the beginning of each of your turn how you're gonna grow, and there's certain ways that you can grow where you like expand your influence on the board so you can go to more places, which also just flat out is the way you level up your character. The more you can expand your influence, the more you level up your character because you take them off the board and you get better stuff. And then there's other things you can do, like learn new powers, and there's also a thing where you get your cards back.
Yeah, because you when you play, but once you've played a power, you need
have to get it back.
Get it back,
and if you get it back with almost anybody else, you don't get to put your influence on the board, so you're not leveling up. You basically have an off turn where you got your powers back, but it usually teaches you a new power. And also there are ways to sometimes like place your influence and learn a new power.
Yeah.
But with the mountain guy, like what it wants to do, it can get all its cards back and place an influence. So you get really encouraged to just, okay, it's fine. I can just get my I don't need a new thing.
I don't
can just
need
get
new
my
powers.
I can get my old powers back and keep leveling up. I don't have to stop. And so, but you can, like, it doesn't stop you from doing it, but it's a relatively strong turn that can sort of trick you late game into realizing, wait a minute, I didn't ever upgrade any of my stuff, and it's late game and everybody else did, and now I don't have any new powers.
Oops, I guess.
But I did place a lot of influence, so I'm strong, but I didn't adapt to the situation.
Yes.
And it's exactly what that character is, like, personality is meant to do, and it just is emergent from the fact that they give you a strong option that kind of can channel you into doing that. So that's an example even on a board game that has this, that makes the board game feel more narrative. Obviously, in tabletop RPGs, it's easier to add more narrative aspects to something. For example, like I gave an example of the Owlbear, which until PF2 was like for a lot of editions barely did anything, and in PF1, even PF1, which had, and 30.5, which had a lot of rules.
Wasn't it like the same?
It was almost exactly the same stats as a dire tiger, so it
yeah.
didn't have pounce. But just by virtue of writing lots of paragraphs about owlbears, it still manages to trick you into, like, getting into it because of the narrative. And the narrative is close enough to the mechanics that you don't realize the mechanics aren't anything special. However, it's even better with in PF2, where, thanks to some cool ideas that Logan had, it can rip out your guts to feed to its young and then hoot around the battlefield.
Yeah. Don't underestimate the power of an evocative name for a power.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what I mean by blending mechanics with narratives. Like,
I mean, how many different powers are there that'll be like, oh yeah, you know, this power that fundamentally boil down to like this power will cause some number
damage,
of people to be some damage,
or debuffs,
or will cause or frighten one, or like that kind of thing, you know. But the flavor that comes on top of that is how you bring that together.
Deal damage and take penalty.
Yes. Deal damage and take penalty is basically what attacks do, right?
Gain a purple cube. Then remove 2 red cubes.
Then move the slider by 1 point.
That's right. Like, it's very important to consider the way that you choose to sort of build a narrative for your mechanics can influence the way that people expect things to work. So we talked about blending it in, and we said, oh, this is good, you should definitely do it, and you should. But you can be setting a trap for yourself if you're not careful about making sure that the narrative actually does lead people to the sort of actions and activities that you want them to take. Because if you pick a narrative that's sort of a little loose, or that you didn't realize it, but it's actually encouraging something that is not the way you want them to play, it can wind up causing more problems down the road.
Yeah, you can definitely come into that from the other direction too with the mechanics. If, like, you know, you expect people to play in a certain way. I think that this is an issue that we ran into with Fate, with some of our home group who are more used to playing like more structured systems like Pathfinder and things like that, where the system encourages you to like get creative and come up with all sorts of different things that you might be doing on your different turns. but then like players found things that they could describe and they're like, yeah, that's very effective, and then they just would like,
Because in Fate, generally what you do is you either, you do a sort of a check to create an aspect in the scene, and then you can do a check to tag that aspect. You can tag an aspect to give like a bonus, and also you could just spend Fate points, a limited resource, to create the aspect automatically. Or tag your own sort of personal traits, like your high concept or your trouble or something like that. So our group discovered that, like, based on the description of their character, like, most of them figured out a thing they could say they were doing every single turn that would definitely create an aspect that could be tagged.
yes.
And then they would just all do that, and then one person would tag all of the aspects and do an attack that used all of the aspects, and it would be very strong, and it would attack the enemy.
Yeah. But that's not. But then that's boring because you're not coming up with new aspects with each scene.
There's nothing in the system that prevented them from doing that. Because there wasn't any limit to creating aspects, other than that they had to roll the check for it, and they always rolled one that they were very good at. There was no reasonable reason as a GM that I could say, well, no, that no longer works, because they picked things that should have worked. And so they were not a good group to run Fate with compared to another group that I ran it with that did not do that. And that is definitely something to keep in mind when you're talking about the narrative and the mechanics of not only parts of a system, but of the entire system itself.
Yeah, whether people are going to engage with it. I think about it too in terms of, video games. One of the sort of the stereotypical thing where you've got a million side quests, but like the world is about to end. And then by the time that you get the sense of urgency, right? But by the time you're done with side quest number 17, you've totally lost that sense of urgency from whatever the last mission you had was.
You know what, Linda? As much as I, as a kid, was very angry that the moon crashed during Majora's Mask when I was in the middle of a boss battle at the end of a temple and I had to redo the entire thing, at least when they say the moon is going to crash, if you go and do a side quest, it will crash and you will die.
Yep.
So they do mean it when they say the moon is going to crash. I guess spoilers for Majora's Mask, but there's a giant moon on, like, the cartridge.
I feel like there's some kind of statute of limitations if the game is more than 20 years old.
Okay, fair enough. There's a giant moon on the cartridge.
Yes.
It's very obvious. It tells you at the beginning that it's going to crash.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. But it is absolutely true. That's a way that that video games often break the bond between narrative and mechanics. Whereas ones that keep that time pressure are games like Persona, where it's just like, yeah, you know what? This person who's trapped in Persona 4, this person who's trapped in the TV world is gonna die on this day. And if you go around just doing social links and do not go into the dungeon, then they die and you lose. You lose the entire game because you just spent all of those time ticks. And it's not the greatest thing that may have happened to you when that occurs. So on the other hand, it can be unfun for people to, like, TPK based on the way that they spend their time, but it certainly gives a pressing sense of urgency to each of the phases that you're taking there, and it fits into the narrative and makes you kind of feel more like you're in it and less like you're sort of detached.
I think that it works well when you have periods where things are, tight and tense and you can't go off and do your random side stuff, and then periods where things are more relaxed. Just like in Pathfinder, you've got periods of downtime, and then you've got your sort of exploration and encounter mode type phases where things are more come on, go.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially what we're saying here is this isn't just for game designers trying to make a monster or a subsystem. Linda pointed out it's literally also for adventure design. Every single thing that touches an RPG needs to think about the way that the mechanics and the narrative work together in a way that makes sense.
And, I think that this also gets into the fact that sometimes you make a conscious decision to create a gap between the mechanics and the narrative because you realize, okay, well, we could model this out, but it wouldn't be fun. And I know this is something that you've mentioned before, too. Like, you could have a system that's like, yes, we're going to track carefully every time, that everything that the PCs are doing, every meal that they eat all the time, every single thing that they do.
Yes, and then we'll see if you need to use the bathroom during
Yes.
during night watch or during one of the encounters.
But any game is going to have some degree of smoothing things over, of abstraction, of things that you choose not to focus on. And yes, that may make the technically make things less realistic, but it's for the sake of making the game more fun.
Absolutely. And then another thing to think about in that regard is ideas of how the mechanics can lead to the narrative you want, even if it's not even if you can think of other narratives that make sense. So, for example, failing forward versus failing and it's just, well, that's it. Both of those are narratives that could make sense. And you could change the mechanics to fit what you want to change. Like, yes, it does make sense that if you fail to climb a cliff, maybe you can't get up the cliff.
Yeah.
But if the adventure is at the top of the cliff, then you have some leeway to be like, battered, bruised, fatigued, you take a bunch of damage, and you eventually make it up the cliff.
All right,
you should have rolled higher.
You searched around, and you eventually realized that you could go up this other side way, because you just couldn't climb here. Unfortunately, the side way, while less steep, was filled with poisonous nettles, so congratulations.
Oh gosh, that reminds me of a time I was running a game with, like, knights, and one of the knights... They saw there was a cliff, and they looked at the bottom of the cliff, and they saw that there was, like, this... the ocean was down there, and there was an underwater place they were trying to get to. And so, like, immediately, one of the knights just jumped off the cliff. And then tried to use a climb check to, like, slow his fall. And he rolled a natural 1, and then I gave him a reflex save because I said there were, like, jagged rocks, and he rolled a natural 1, and he impaled himself on a rock, and he nearly died, and the priest came down and, like, they managed to unimpale him, and then the priest, like, ready to action, healed him in the air before he hit the ground again, because he would have otherwise died. Now, why was the priest down there to do that healing? Oh, because, like, a moment after he jumped off the cliff, I think he did, like, try to attach a rope to himself or something like that.
And then it failed, yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, right. It wasn't quite as bad. I shouldn't make fun of that guy. So he told another person to hold the other end of the rope. Now, the other guy was like, wait a minute. And then he went to the side, and he was like, is there another way down? I was like, yeah, there's, like, a shallow, like, path that you can just go down. He's like, is it a climb check? I was like, no. It's on the other side. He was like, great. And he was like, everyone, come down this way. And then the first knight was like, hey, wait, are you holding my rope? He's like, no, I let go of it. I went to check, and we could just go down. And the other knight's like, oh, crap. And so I was like, you're climbing down the rope, and then suddenly there's no more rope. So first of all, like, he tried to do a ridiculous climb. And second of all, he left it with a really irresponsible person who, it was in character for that other guy to just go wander off and find the other way down. But also, just, like, there just was another way down, and he didn't look for it.
Just immediately went to that.
Yep.
Although, I think while that was funny in that case, that sort of thing can sometimes be taken too far if, like, the GM doesn't give you a chance to explore things, but he's just like, I'm gonna go down the road.
That wasn't me.
Yeah.
He even asked, he was like, wait, aren't you holding the end of the rope? He's like, no, I didn't. I went to the other side.
Yeah, well, like, he could have, like, looked around for another way. You're like, there's a cliff. He's like, I'm gonna climb down it with my rope. I'm gonna trust
He didn't look at all for another way. It wasn't immediately obvious. You couldn't see it unless you went around to the other side.
You had to explore a little for the alternative.
You had to, like, do the bare minimum. Like, also, to be fair, like, I described that there was another side that you could go to and other things like that, and he was like, I'm gonna look down the cliff, and I told him what was down the cliff. He's like, alright, I climbed down with my rope. You hold this side of the rope. Like, he should have tied it up.
Yep.
Probably.
I'm sure that no one ever trusted that the other guy to hold the rope again.
I mean, nobody should have trusted him to hold a rope in the first place.
Was that a Tobias?
Yeah, but not the one that you played with. The other one.
Fair enough.
And
I've heard stories of that one.
You shouldn't. You knew who it was.
Yes.
Because you played with another person playing that pre-gen character, and it obviously is someone that you wouldn't
trust. You do not trust that character. Why would you trust that character?
But he totally found a way down. So the point is, by making that easy way to get down that cliff, I also knew, since the adventure was at the bottom of the cliff, that I was just going to put that there. I did not expect someone to try to just, like, climb down the sheer cliff with the rope.
You know, they lived in the end.
Yes.
And a lesson was learned.
Everybody lived, and the priest chided the knight for foolishly jumping the gun, and for foolishly trusting the other guy. And the other guy who was holding the rope was like, yeah, I agree, you shouldn't have trusted me with this rope. I wouldn't have.
Oh, dear.
I think we've covered some of the big principles I wanted to get through with blending mechanics and narrative, and I hopefully have convinced you why it's really important to do it. It just makes the playing experience more fun for everyone at the table. You will have less arguments, or fewer arguments at the table, because the narrative will naturally channel
and
into
people aren't going to be like, wait, it would make
want.
sense for me to be able to do this. Why can't I do that? A lot of those come from when there's a mismatch.
Yeah, that's what they come from. Like the example I gave about the super fiat, this person can't roll the check again, versus, hey, there's no time. You were talking. If they're like, no, I want to talk to Lord Fancy Pants. It's like, well, you were talking to Lady Snooty Nose during that time, so you couldn't talk to him.
This is
you
in
could talk
Tal'Dorei,
to, you could talk to Lord Fancy Pants next time. And so, like, it just works. It makes the social contract easier for your table. It makes your RPG easier to learn, to understand, and it makes your design more powerful. So to level up your game design, always make sure blend mechanics and narrative. Don't just do one without the other. Don't just be like, oh, I'll just do the mechanics now, and all the way at the end I'll come up with some kind of narrative for it, or vice versa. Make them together. Iterate them in a living process.
Well, I mean, just like with Pathfinder and Starfinder, how they have Galarian and the Pack World setting connected to them.
Absolutely. Intertwine, and you will create a stronger and more effective design. So, do we have any questions in chat about blending mechanics and narrative from our Design Diary viewers? If not, then I would say that this could be a good time to say goodbye to YouTube.
Bye, YouTube!
Bye, YouTube! See you next time!